to ask you another question. This can be a bit difficult to answer, but what do you think is the source of his love for Jesus?
Well, first of all, he came early into contact with Jesuits when he was about 11 years old, and from that time on. And the Jesuits especially inherited from our founder, St. Ignatius Loyola, a program of prayer which we call the spiritual exercises. And certainly from a very early age, and then a number of times afterwards, he went through, under guidance, the spiritual exercises. And the center, the main theme of the spiritual exercises is to know Jesus. That is, to know about his life and his teaching and his spirit, and especially that knowledge of Jesus is kind of summed up in what we call devotion to the heart of Jesus. So he was very much impressed by that, and for his whole lifetime he talked about that frequently. So anyway, under the guidance of this, and based on his faith, he came to know Jesus very intimately, and prayed to Jesus and tried to live like Jesus. So that was one of the deeper motivations of his whole life, and he often talked about that and even wrote some short studies or short books or essays about the devotion, we call it the devotion to the heart of Jesus. And he has some very beautiful writings about that. And I think that was the deeper motivation of his whole life.
I have a question related to his training for novices. Are there any characteristics or something in his training method?
Well, the training was more or less standard, which would be a novitiate of 2 years, in which he would be really a study of an exercise of faith. And the key, one of the key exercises of that novitiate is a 30-day retreat, we call it. That was for 30 days lived in silence and prayer. And of course he would be get some instruction from what we call the master of the novices. And well, that's standard for all Jesuits. And then he went through the standard training, which would be first some training, some study of literature and culture, and then a study of philosophy for 3 years, and then you might say there's sort of an experimental year where he would do some experience, but because of the situation of Spain, the Jesuits, that is the younger Jesuits who were in training, they all left Spain because there was politically there was trouble, and the government completely changed, and the government, if anything, was somewhat opposed to the Catholic faith and the church. Not all of the Jesuits left Spain, but just those who were in training, as it were. So he went to Belgium, and so he did several years of theology study in Belgium, and then for one more year of theology study, he was moved to a Jesuit house which was in Belgium, because the German Jesuits also, at least those in their formation, their training, were left Germany because of the political situation. They're very similar. So in that case, he studied with young Germans. In Belgium, he spoke French there, and then he went to a German-speaking house, and he learned German. And at that time, he already was, his Jesuit superiors were already guiding him in the direction of the medical ethics. And so at that time, besides his standard studies, he was doing study in ethics, medical ethics, under some very eminent people in that area. And so he was continuing his, then he went to the USA for 1 year, continuing his study of medical ethics. And then in the US, he had some more Jesuit training, I should say, and then some experience of working among Spanish immigrants in the USA. But that was a very short time, actually. And so at that point, he had already told his Jesuit superiors 10 years before, and he often wrote to the general superior in Rome that he wanted, if possible, to be assigned to Japan. So just at that time, he did receive a letter from the general superior in Rome saying, go to Japan. Up to that time, he had no assurance that he would ever go to Japan, but he had asked frequently, and the superior said, yes, go to Japan. And he did. He arrived in Japan in what year was it? It would be, I thought I wrote it down somewhere. Oh yes, he arrived in 1938. So since he was born in 7, he was 31 years old at that time. And then, of course, he had to learn Japanese first. He had no studies in Japanese at all. Or he did, in fact, he knew rather little about Japan, especially modern Japan. So he studied Japanese. At that time, he was living in Yamaguchi at that time, which was a mission of mostly Spanish Jesuits were working there. And there he studied Japanese. He must have studied rather informally, maybe with a tutor. There was no special Japanese language school there. And after a short time there, he was appointed to be what we call the Master of Novices, training the novices. Of course, the novices at that time were all Japanese, young Japanese. And so then he moved to Nagasaki, where he was for some time. I don't know if I should go on talking about his
Yeah,
career.
I was going to.
But you want to ask about his hospital, Eddie?
Oh yes, I would really.
Well,
love to.
he was in Nagasaki
Mhm.
in the position of Master of Novices and in charge of that small group of Jesuits in Nagasaki when the atom bomb fell on Hiroshima. Shall I talk about his experience there?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes, please.
Well, the house where he was living in Nagasaki was damaged a little bit because especially by the shock wave, which rattled the house and knocked some tiles off the roof and broke all the windows and so on. But there was no one in that house was seriously injured. Some of them had some glass in their back, and the windows must have just broken into fragments when the shock came. But within a couple of hours after the bomb dropped, people began to come out of the city towards the suburbs where he was. Because the whole city was not only destroyed, but the houses were burning. One of the great, much of the damage of Hiroshima was made by the shock of the bomb. It broke down many houses, and it was 8:15 in the morning when the bomb exploded. And you have to realize the bomb was not on the ground, it was up in the air, about 700 meters up in the air. So it came down on the city, the shock of the bomb came down on the city and crushed many houses. And at that time, it was just about time for breakfast or shortly after. And at that time, most people in the house had a hibachi for cooking. So when the house fell down, of course, it caught fire. And so many houses were burning in the city. So people were trying to get out of the city. And those who could still walk, or some, came near the novitiate house where ARRUPE was. And those who could walk were still not so badly injured, as many were killed, of course, immediately. But they had many cuts and skin lesions. And so he took them into the novitiate house, and they used every possible space they had, like the library room and the chapel room and everything. They made it into as much as possible into it couldn't be a real hospital because they didn't have the equipment or anything, but they had a place where people could lie down and be treated. And so he was a doctor, of course, and so he thought immediately, how can I treat these people, especially with burns? They were burned by the heat of the bomb. You know, so just when he was thinking of what to do with these people, he was taking them in, but he had no adequate medicines or anything to do anything for them. But just then, a man who had been employed in the novitiate, he wasn't a Jesuit, but he was working for them. He came and with a big sack on his back, filled with little bottles of, what in English you say, boric acid, hosan, I think it's called in Japanese. There were little bottles of hosan and boric acid. And he knew from his medical training that this was a good antiseptic. And so he used these this boric acid, just putting it on the wounds, it's an antiseptic. It doesn't, at least it keeps the wounds from becoming infected. And then they cut up all the bed sheets in the novitiate, and even they cut up even some underwear, make little strips of cloth that they could put over the wound, and then he would moisten the cloth with this boric acid. And that turned out to be a very effective treatment. Well, it's the only thing he had, and he only had it by accident, that this employee, like an angel, came with a big bag of little bottles of boric acid. And so actually no one died that was taken into the novitiate. They probably had at the peak of maybe more than 100 people there, lying on the floor all over the place. Fortunately, it was a tatami building, so it was easy to find place for them to lie down. And so there were some sisters also in the neighborhood who came to help, and other people. And so once they determined the treatment, they would just go around and moisten the cloth that was lying over the wounds, and let the natural strength of the people. And of course they realized that people need strength, so they collected all the food and vegetables they could get their hands on, and gave them good meals so that they would heal quickly. And then when he knew the secret of treating this with boric acid, he also went around the neighborhood to the houses in the neighborhood where there were also people who had come out of the city and were temporarily living in these residences which were not destroyed. And so he became a kind of a neighborhood doctor too, going around. Because once the treatment had been determined, anyone could do it. They would just go around to the patients and moisten the cloth with boric acid. And at that time he wrote in his diary that the people who were there, they made no sound. They weren't crying or although they were suffering very much. There were cuts and burns on their bodies. Sometimes I know one man who was healed in his hospital, and he was a small boy playing in the schoolyard with his upper body was all naked, and fortunately he wasn't looking at the bomb, but yet the bomb was in back of him, and so his whole back was completely burned. And even now, I was once in the swimming pool with him, and his back it's horrible to look at. It's just all twisted, but it's healed, and he can live a normal life. Anyway, that was a great experience for him. Experience of the bomb, helping people, and he was frequently marveled at the gaman syosa of the Japanese people who were there in the hospital. They were very quiet. They weren't screaming or crying.
Well, I still can't believe that he and his followers took care of more than 100 people dying.
Oh yes, I think it was 150 I saw once the number. But the house was completely filled because it was a house where ordinarily would be only about 30 people living.
Do you think if there is any like major change in Father ARRUPE, like before and after this atomic bomb?
Do I think that people have changed? Or did he think?
Do you think that Father ARRUPE had any change?
Well, he already had experience already from a young teenager on of visiting the very poor people in Spain. So he had a kind of a heart for people who are suffering and not only physically but their lifestyle is completely poor, nothing to live on. So that was very much a part of his early years in Spain, and this contributed also to his impression. So I did.
Thank you. I would like to ask you a story maybe after he became a Jesuit superior. What do you think? What do you think the job as a Jesuit superior mean to him?
As a Jesuit, yes. Yes, soon it was in 1954, I think, that at that time he was still in Nagasaki after the war for a number of years and training the younger Japanese Jesuits. And then there was a kind of an emergency. The man, German Jesuit, was our superior, major superior. And but he became suddenly sick, unable to carry on. And so Father ARRUPE was called suddenly from Nagasaki to be the substitute, what we would say the deity, because he was not officially appointed, but it was to take over. And then the actual superior had to stay on in Europe for a rather long time. And so at that time our general superior in Rome changed the superior in Japan and made Father ARRUPE we call it Kankatso, or we say provincial usually, of Japan. And that was about 1954. At that time, Japan was, within the Jesuit organization, was called a vice province. In other words, not yet a full province. And so he was the head of the vice province for 4 years. And then, because the number of Jesuits in Japan was increasing and various things we were doing were increasing, our general superior made Japan a full province of the Jesuits. And then Father ARRUPE was appointed to be the provincial of the new province of Japan. And that usually in a provincial time of office, period of offices, is at most 6 years. Well, Father ARRUPE then had reached the 6-year limit, so because he had been provincial of the vice province and then of the province, altogether it was already 10 years that he had been superior. And at that time, the Jesuits were having a general congregation when 3 representatives from every province goes to Rome, and there are many serious things they have to discuss. And one of the things they had to discuss was who will be the next general superior, because the previous man had died just 2 years before that. And it was 1964. And so in Rome, when they elected the general superior, they elected Father ARRUPE as the general superior. So as a higher superior of the Jesuits, he had 10 years in Japan, and then, let's see, I don't remember how many years, about 18, 19 years in Rome before he got sick. So he had a long period as general superior. And during that time, I always had some contact with him. Of course, while he was still in Japan for 10 years, I would meet him every year, and the standard meeting with the provincial, which took place every year individually. And then, after he had been in Rome for a while, I was appointed to be the provincial of Japan. And so he was my direct superior as general superior. And in the Jesuits, we had the custom of writing letters very frequently about things that are going on, and getting instructions from Rome or explaining situations which occur in Japan. That's a close connection with him. But in the beginning of my period as provincial, I and other new provincials were called to Rome for a short orientation, you want to call it, or since everyone who went was a new superior, a general provincial, and so we would meet with the general superior, Father ARRUPE, over a period of about 10 days, and he would more or less stay with us and eat with us and discuss with us, and so I got to know him again very much at that time. But as a question about his style of being a superior. Well, I'll start off first with what he was criticized for. He was criticized often for being too lenient. In other words, sometimes when there was a difficulty which some people thought that he should be very strict, very severe, and take action right away. He wasn't, and so he was criticized for that by some. And then another thing it's kind of a criticism but also a praise, that he was a dreamer. He would dream about things that could be done. For instance, once I saw in one of his letters that at that time we had 3 middle high schools in Japan. In Eiko Gakuen, Roko Gakuen, and Hiroshima Gakuen. And he realized, of course, that many of the recruits, Jesuit recruits, were graduates of those schools. So he said, he and many others too said, well, it would be good if we had more of those middle high schools in different parts of Japan. It would help in recruiting young Japanese to be Jesuits. And so he wrote in one letter, instead of 3, we should have 6. He even had determined more or less what cities they would be in, Well, most of the Jesuits here in Japan said, oh, we have enough on our hands now. That would be doubling. And that was a kind of a dream of his. Well, that dream came true in the fact that we started one more high school. That's when Hiroshima Gakuen began. And then later the Jesuits took over a school which was already going in Fukuoka, which is now called Jochi Fukuoka. That's the name they have now. But that's one example of a dream of his. So that's one thing that he was accused of, but then others praised him for dreaming of what could be, you know. Mm-hmm. But the criticism was he had no plan for how to realize the dream. So, but another example of his dream was later in 1980. It was a time of the end of the Vietnam War, and the so-called boat people were refugees from out of Vietnam, were coming out in small fishing boats into the South China Sea in the hope that they would be picked up by some larger ship and taken to some other country. At that time, many came to Japan on ships at that time. We usually refer to them as the boat people because they came out in small fishing boats into the ocean at great danger because they would, if they were caught, they would be punished, and they had no assurance that there would be some big ship to pick them up. So some of them, I think, either starved or in a storm capsized a small boat. So many were killed also in that. Anyway, he knew about this situation, and he said, we, and himself of course, we cannot allow these people to suffer this way. We have to give them a place. And so he began with a small idea that Jesuits should do something. But again, it's like a dream. He said, well, what can we do? You know, we're not equipped for caring for refugees or anything. But he said, well, let's do something anyway. So they started what is called now the Jesuit Refugee Service. And it's still centered in the Jesuit headquarters. And the Jesuit General Superior is the general head of this Jesuit Refugee Service. But it has expanded into taking care of refugees all around the world in different places. And Jesuits are involved, but also many volunteers who are not Jesuits but have come to join. And so we have, it's already 40 years has passed, and it's usually called, in Japanese they call it just by the JRS, Jesuit Refugee Service. They, of course, Jesuits are not really equipped to take care of refugees, you know, care for the children and women and children and help them with all of their problems. But so they centered their help on, well, first of all, just to get them a place to stay when they come out of their country. For example, at present, there are many refugees coming into Europe. They usually come into South Europe, Italy, or especially Italy and Greece. But then they go into other European countries. And it's a great need because the refugees are coming out of North Africa without anything. They just come. They have to pay money to get into some boat that will take them over. But there are refugees all around the world now, and the Jesuits, not only the Jesuits personally, but I mean their helpers. They have a large organization now for helping many refugees. But that was a kind of a dream of his, which grew, was carried out.
I believe that he was such a dreamer, like you said,
Yes.
and also I really like his style because he always said we have to do something,
That's right.
and then wait for other people to like kind of follow him.
Yes.
And, yeah.
So there were many things like